Hi there, it's the first Sunday after Epiphany, and I thought that I'd share a short reflection on the scripture reading that has been set for today, just the gospel reading, which is from Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 to 12. So feel free to pause the video, have a read of that, and then listen to the rest of the video. So it's the first Sunday of Epiphany. Epiphany is about illumination, about the good news of Christ being revealed to the nations. And Epiphany began this year on Thursday, which was also 1 year since the same day that white supremacists attempted an insurrection in Washington, D.C. And they were being encouraged by the outgoing United States president after he'd lost the election. That was Epiphany 2021. These events were certainly illuminating for folks who hadn't been convinced about the dangers of that movement that was centered around the previous president. When we look at churches in the United States, most white Christians supported him, not just evangelical churches, but also the mainline churches and Catholic churches. Most white Christians supported him, even though he was associated with white supremacists and even though he promoted racial divisions in that country. And insurgents in Washington a year ago, they were seen holding banners saying things like, "Jesus saves." There's been a problem of white supremacy in the church. And while it might look more polite sometimes here in these lands that we now call Australia, it's still a problem. It's a problem when we forget that our sacred stories are not white people's stories, but they're stories that come from the Eastern Mediterranean, the place where Asia meets Africa and Europe. That's where all of the stories in the Bible take place. When we imagine these stories, we shouldn't be imagining pale Western Europeans. It makes more sense to picture brown and black and olive-coloured faces. And when our theology uses language that associates lightness with goodness and darkness with badness, we also suggest, even if it's unintentional, that white folks are good and enlightened, and that black or brown folks are bad and ignorant. Jesus isn't a white Aryan from the Midwest of the United States. He's a Palestinian Jew. As we reflect on these stories about the Holy Family that have been suggested for today, and as we hear about the travelling astrologers and about Herod's court, let's keep in mind that these are not white European characters. They're people from the Fertile Crescent. They're people from the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean. Over Christmas, we heard a lot from Luke's version of the Nativity story, but today we've heard from Matthew's Gospel. And in Matthew, the story takes a different route. In Luke, the Nativity was followed by the story of Jesus being dedicated in the Jewish temple, but in Matthew, the story of Jesus is followed closely by danger, a conspiracy in the capital, led by the reigning king. There are ways that I think we've sometimes sentimentalized this story. We've often said that the gifts of the Magi, or the wise men, as they've often been called, are the reason that we give presents at Christmas. But I wonder if that's just a way that Christians have been trying to convince ourselves that our society is still celebrating a Christian holiday. I think there's a lot more going on in the story than just giving presents. It's important to look at who the Magi are. There's a couple of possibilities. They might be people who practice magic, something that was forbidden for Jewish people and something that's also been forbidden in Christian churches. The other possibility is that they were Persian scholars who study the stars as a form of divination, and that was also often disapproved of in Judaism and in Christianity. The understanding in this part of the ancient world where these stories were happening was that the events on the earth reflected events in the heavens. So it made sense, according to that understanding of the world, to say that astrology could reveal world events. So these visitors are people who practice magic, or they're Persian astrologers. It could be that they're both. So we have foreign wizards coming to Jerusalem and asking questions about a new king, wanting to come and worship him. For Matthew, this is about making it clear that the good news of Christ has been shared with the nations, that it's not only for Jewish people. It's also important to look at who Herod the king is. Even though Herod is here in the Nativity story, we often don't hear much about Herod when the Christmas story, the Nativity story, is told. There's a few different Herods that get mentioned in the Christian scripture, and they're all part of the same family. This Herod, though, is not the same Herod that's reigning later on when Jesus is eventually executed. And he's not the same Herod who turns up later in the book of Acts. This particular Herod, though, was a violent ruler who had many people killed, including his wife and several sons-in-law. As soon as his name was mentioned in the story, the people who heard this story would have had those murders in their memories. How would we expect a murderous king to respond to foreign visitors coming to his court asking about the birth of a king who he knows nothing about? They clearly aren't talking about his heir. What he does is calls in the clergy, the priests, and they help him work out what's going on. Even though they know that he's a bad king, a murderer, the clergy come to his court and help him. I wonder what their reasoning was. Did they figure that despite his violence, it was good to have him on side? Or were they okay with what he was doing? Herod had extended and renovated the temple that they used, so maybe they felt like they owed him a favour. Or could it be that they thought they could change Herod's ways? Maybe they thought they could reform him. Maybe they were convinced that he really did want to go and worship the child himself. Luckily, we're provided with a contrasting example. While it made sense to begin with for the Magi to go and consult with the reigning king, when they figure out what's going on, they don't return to him. Instead, they return to their homeland by a different route. What I think this says to us is that even if we've made the mistake before, we don't have to return to the strongmen and dictators, the world leaders who love themselves and promote fear in order to stay in power. We don't have to keep doing that. We don't worship those men. We worship the poor child who has escaped that king. Whatever light we're following, if we find that it leads us to a strong man like Herod, it's a false light. The true light leads us to solidarity with those who are in danger, like the child Jesus was.